Stand by for broadcast.
You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hello, I'm Flight Lieutenant Peter Lisney, and in this episode we find out what the future holds for RAF reservists. We'll also reheat a few stories, just in case you missed them. But first, see if you can identify this noise. Find out if you're right at the end of this episode. Now, whether someone is new to military life or they've already served a full career in the regulars, the RAF Reserves continues to attract talent keen to wear the light blue uniform. But what is the motivation to juggle a civilian job with an RAF job? Have attitudes towards reservists changed? And what does Future Reserves 30 mean to these part-time aviators?
To me, it doesn't matter if you're male or female. At the end of the day, it's what you've got a passion for.
The employers are likely to not release them again, and perhaps justifiably so.
It's a valid question, but it's more about equity and fairness than it is about pure numbers, I think.
Aircraft woman Lee joined 4624 Squadron 18 months ago to become an RAF mover. I asked AC Lee why she decided to join as a reservist.
So I actually was going to join as a regular, probably about 6-7 years ago, and for health issues, it kind of stopped me, and I didn't. But I still had that kind of itch that I wanted to scratch, and I knew that I still wanted to do it. So about 3 years ago, I kind of went online again to join as a regular, and I was about to hit the apply to regulars, and I thought, I can't do it. I just had so many different commitments now, kind of those so many years on, and I just thought I can't commit myself to full time. So it was funny, my mouse hovered over the reserves, and I thought, that's something I've never really considered or really even thought of. I guess the motivation of it was I knew I wanted to do something exciting. I didn't want to just sit in an office doing my day job, but I kind of had to do that because of the commitments that I'd kind of made in those 3 years. And I think even now, like, I look back and I think I'm so glad, because it gave me the freedom to do both. And I think to have my life here also, but also to be able to go out and learn new things and potentially, hopefully soon, travel and meet loads of different people. And yeah, it's just something completely different.
AC Lee, you've been in the Air Force 18 months. You've got this plot ahead of you. You expect to be deploying overseas. Tell me about the balance between a full-time civilian work and having this part-time reservist work. What to you are the real benefits of having both in your life?
I think, obviously, my civilian job, I do the same thing daily, in and out, and I guess for any person that does a full-time job, they kind of get this lull of, okay, I'm doing the same thing. Here I am going into work. Whereas at a weekend, I can switch it up and do something more exciting and learn new things. And that's what the reservist kind of gives me the opportunity to do that. Because again, even if I did it as a regular job, I would probably find that lull and be, okay, yeah, this isn't as exciting as I was hoping it would kind of be. So yeah, I think it gives me that balance of, okay, I've got my normal routine, but then I've got this excitement at a weekend of being able to go off and explore.
And of course, it's not every weekend. You don't work 7 days a week.
No, I don't. No. Yeah, I'll put that out there. Yeah, no, I don't.
Right.
Yeah, it's just once a month.
Some reservists, like AC Lee, join without previous military experience, but for others, it's a return to uniform after a break in service. For Warrant Officer Roberts, it happened the day after completing 33 years as a regular in the Royal Air Force Police.
I left the regulars in 2019, and I immediately joined the reserves. Seamless transfer, no break, 1 day regular, next day I was a reservist.
Mr. Roberts, what were the motivations for you to switch across from regular to reserve?
When I was a regular and I became the squadron warrant officer, I hadn't had any dealings really throughout my whole career with the reserves. There was a belief that they weren't really of much use. They were like a TA, Dad's Army type organisation that us regulars didn't feel the need to use. When I joined the squadron, I realised just how professional an outfit they actually are and how much experience there is to call upon in those that might just be corporals but are a detective inspector in their day job. And I worked with them at REACT, well, the International Air Tattoo that we do the security for as a reserve squadron every year. And I went on my first year as a regular warrant officer with them to do REACT, and I was totally impressed by how they responded to the 2 weeks of really hard work, long hours, without a grumble, a groan, and they absolutely loved it. So for me, my view was changed when I was a regular, but working for the reserves. So when I came to the end of my regular service, it was a no-brainer. I was always going to join the reserves.
Okay, I've got to ask you, what do your old mates from your previous regular career think about you going over to the reserves?
Well, to be honest, the whole view of reserves is changing. We are trying to change because we'd like to recruit ex-regulars. But anyone who knows us and anyone who deals with us now, and with the last 4 or 5 years, the reserves have done an awful lot of mobilizations in support of wider force. And anyone who works with them generally comes back with, they were really good. They were really, really good, and we'll work with them again. So I think that the reserves are getting it out there that we are here to help, and that they can actually just step straight into a regular slot if necessary. Again,
something else I need to ask you. You've served a full regular career, presumably to the point where you'd get a full pension. Why didn't you just hang up your truncheon and enjoy life a little? Why did you come into the reserves?
I think after 33 years, you are indoctrinated. Everything about you is the RAF or whichever force you're in. And leaving, it felt okay to join the reserve straight away because I maintained that teamwork, that camaraderie, the whole. And I've got young people working for me now who are ex-RAF police, joined the civilian police, and they came back into the reserves because they missed the teamwork. It isn't quite the same in the civilian police as it is in the military. So that's probably why I didn't, and I'm too young to retire yet. My wife would give me far too many jobs to do at home, so because she's a serving full-time warrant officer as well. So.
In May this year, the Ministry of Defence published the Reserve Forces Review 2030. Search online and you should find a copy. I asked Air Vice Marshal Ranald Monroe, Commandant General of the Royal Auxiliary Air Force and a part-time volunteer reservist, to explain what the document is all about and why it is important to both our regulars and reserves.
RF 30, Reserve Forces 30, comes on the back of FR 20, Future Reserve 2020. And FR 20 was all about growth in numerical terms of the single services reserves. RF 30 is about utility and usability. So what do we use our reserves for, and how easy is it to use them? And that's what RF 30 is all about. And to do that, of course, is looking at capabilities, but also the policies on mobilization. What else? What other tasks can reserves undertake? Is it warfighting, or is it to use the integrating operating concept language? Is it operate, i.e., the threshold, operating the threshold below, in the grey area below war? And the answer is, of course, we want our reserves to do everything, all the way from warfighting to routine capability, which is what we're very good at in the RAF Reserve.
So does that mean there's going to be a restructuring of the Royal Air Force Reserve?
Not a restructuring, and actually RF 30 is whilst it's a tri-service initiative, actually, we shaped it significantly by having people on the RF30 team. And in fact, reserve optimization, which is the RAF's reserve component to Astra, the journey to the new generation Air Force 2035-40, we had that in train before RF30. So we helped RF30, shaped RF30, contributed to it. And I'd say RF30 does not constrain anything that we are doing in the RAF, but in fact, it validates what we are doing in the RAF. And it certainly very clearly identifies those things that we need the center to deal with for us, either tri-service things that we cannot affect within the RAF, but we will certainly support the changes. So in terms of changes, the changes such that they are, and I might mention some of the ambitions we have for our reserve, those changes are what we want to make. They're not being forced on us by the centre. We are very ambitious for our reserves. We are looking to grow our reserves. We're looking to have a greater proportion of our reserves being PTVR, part-time volunteer reserves. That's not to say the FTRS component is not important. They're massively important because they provide the framework or the skeleton around which we build our PTVR component. So we want a bigger reserve, bigger component being PTVR. We want to lead in certain capabilities, the sunrise capabilities in coding, data analytics, cyber, space. We think we can lead in some of those areas. They're like doctors. They're really expensive. We can't afford them all the time. But actually, we want them in Civvy Street because that's where they maintain their SQIP. And of course, all of that to recruit and retain really quality people, this is what we're after. We're after talent. We need to give them a career structure. And we don't really have that in the RAF Reserve for officers. We do for NCOs. We can do better, but we have nothing for officers. So the ambition is significant. Bigger reserve, bigger component being PDVR, leading in sunrise capabilities, career structures, and being prepared to go where the industries are that we're looking to recruit from. And of course, giving then, going back to the career structures, more command opportunities, more opportunities to serve on the staff. As Chief of the Air Staff says, to sprinkle reserves across the whole of the organization. So somebody's there for reserves when we're creating policy or deciding on utility of reserves. So we want to generate our own two-star capability as a reservist, PTBR, from somebody who starts at the bottom end and gets up to two-star, and likewise for warrant officer.
Regulars who listen to Inside Air, should they be concerned at all about the growth of reserves? Does it mean that there's going to be fewer posts that are regular? Is it a value for money thing? Is it all about budget?
Well, I think defence is changing, and the reality is, there are financial constraints. We haven't got all the money to do all the things we want to do. So that is certainly part of the equation, fixed cost and variable cost, and reserves to some extent is a variable cost because you don't have to pay them full whack all the time. You pay them when they come in and they do stuff for you. And indeed, whether it's on RSDs, as we had on Rescript, utility on RSDs, or indeed
RSD, that's a daily payment.
It's daily payment, so reserves a service day, so paying them on a daily rate, or you mobilize them, in which case you pay them as you would a regular. So in either way, you're getting real utility. So there's a variable cost element to that, but actually much more important than that is the range of new skills that we need, which are much more focused on information advantage and data analytics. That's the world that we're moving into, and we need more of that in the RAF. And so, there's, of course, financial constraints are one thing, but it's the new skills that we're looking for. So inevitably, I think there is going to be, and has been until now, and the wave and the trend that we're riding is an increasing number of reserves within our armed forces, and the RAF is no different. That does not necessarily mean at a cost of regulars. Now, what effect that will have on regulars downline, especially if we move in from piloted platforms to unmanned or uncrewed platforms, that's another thing. But I don't think it's just because you have more reserves, therefore you have less regulars. But of course, both these things will go in tandem in terms of what that force mix should be. So I don't think the RAF regulars should be concerned about reserves, and what they should do is embrace that opportunity to do things differently and get a new skill set in that they can use as required to deliver capability for the RAF.
So the Chief of the Air Staff recently spoke about a zigzag career where someone may move between regular service and reserve service. So how close are we to be able to move from regular service, maybe in our mid-30s, to go into Civvy Street and go deep technical and learn a subject and then remain a reservist and then come back in. Is that really going to be possible?
I think the answer is yes, and we're doing it now. But it's clunky. So the aspiration absolutely is to get people who come in to the RAF the same standard for the role that they will undertake, go left, become a regular, go right and become part-time, and go further right and become a reservist. And any individual should be able to go from top to bottom, or left to right, or right to left, up and down that chain, the continuum of employment, as we call it. That absolutely should be possible, and that's what we should be doing, because we want to be flexible, a flexible employer, allowing people to serve in ways that suit them. And of course, we will have a shout as well in terms of some roles will have to be a regular role just by the dint of the nature of the role, but most roles will be able to go up and down, so people can have a career. As you say, a zigzag career from regular to FTRS to additional duties commitment, which is part-time, or reservist, and going the other way. We do it now. It's clunky. We need to get better at it, and there's a big discussion. What else do we need to make it to free that and oil that continuum? And I think one school of thought says we need one emerging of the Reserve Forces Act, the Armed Forces Act. I know the lawyers are looking at that and thinking, well, actually, maybe rather than having a single act, or we need some addenda to both that allows that sort of bridge, if you like, without going through a whole process of creating one act, which will be certainly costly and will take time.
We heard earlier from Warrant Officer Roberts, who moved from the regulars to the reserves after 33 years of service. I also spoke with Flight Lieutenant Ewan, who made the move in the opposite direction.
The reserves acted as a useful window into a life that I hadn't considered before. I've been really enjoying my reservist career. So actually, let's have a look at what is on offer in the regulars.
How did your reserves training prepare you for commissioning and going through, first of all, Officer Aircrew Selection Centre, but really importantly, initial officer training?
What the reservists squeeze into 2 weeks, Cranwell essentially stretches out into, when I was doing it, into 8 weeks. I had done several weapons handling tests. I had passed them all. Therefore, it wasn't a new experience. I wasn't afraid of the rifle. I knew how to camp out for an evening, how to arrange one's room, how to press one's uniform. So all those basic fundamental skills were transferable directly into Cranwell, certainly for that first term.
This preparation must have helped you along the way, no doubt, because it was a real proud moment in media reserves when we found out that you had been awarded this sort of honour as top cadet in your intake.
In many ways, I was actually surprised as anyone. I knew I was potentially in with a shot because I had done very well on the academic side of things. Yeah, I was quite pleasantly stunned in a way that I came out on top. Proof that geeks can come through in the end, I guess.
Now, chances are there's a reservist probably out for a run listening to this, and they're thinking, should I go for my commission? What sort of advice can you give a serving reservist that's looking at their career and thinking about commission? What should they be thinking?
I think if their thoughts are leaning towards a commission in the regulars, they should definitely discuss it with their chain of command at their reserve squadron, because in addition to my experience at Halton, my reserve squadron, once they found out that I was going to go for regular officer selection, they were able to put together an official program, so to speak, where they would allow me to practice, various leadership tasks that you get at officer selection. I think ultimately you have to know what you're getting into, and I did, and therefore I don't regret at all making the transition from the reserves to the regulars. I dare say that once my regular career concludes, whenever that may be, I would say it's highly likely that I will look to rejoin the reserves once again. So if there is a spot in 7644 Squadron in some point in the next 10 or 20 years or so, then please keep a seat free for me.
Having heard a few of the reasons why someone might choose to follow a career in the reserves and even use it as a launch pad to join the regulars, I was interested to know how reservists fit into the mix of personnel currently deployed on operations. Air Vice Marshal Munro.
The numbers out of the Dacos Reserves area consistently show that pre-COVID, we spend about 51% of our reserve service days, the daily rates of pay, on delivering utility. So not training, digging a trench somewhere, or going for a run, but actually utility across all the capabilities, which is impressive. And then we usually have about 19% of our trained force, and bear in mind the trained force of PTBRs is just over 2,000. 19% of those have been mobilized. Because of COVID, those numbers have gone up to 54% routine use on RSDs and delivering capability. And I think it's 29% of the trained force being mobilized, both on rescript, but also on continuing tasks, as dictated to by Air Command. I mean, that's a massive return on investment in terms of people. And I can't remember what the number is, but if you convert that to FTEs, is somewhere around about 200 FTEs, full-time equivalents. Again, that's a significant benefit to commanders who are looking from agility and flexibility from their workforce. Now, I think the aspiration going forward is that, and we haven't landed on a number yet, but I wouldn't be far off wrong when we say that the aspiration is that we want to have about 10% of the reserves in any activity that the RAF get involved in. So, for example, Afghanistan or Iraq, and of course in some trades, medical, it'll be even higher percentage. But generally, we would like to see about 10% of any force being deployed being reservists. Why is that important? It goes back to my narrative. In the reserves, if you think of the narrative left of ARC, the commitment that we give is training. So there's 27 days, the average is 32 in the RAF Reserve. So that's a commitment. The other end of that spectrum, go right end of that spectrum, the commitment to deploy if you get the brown envelope saying we're off. The bit in the middle are the opportunities that we need to provide our reserves. That's what they want. And so that greater integration that we're looking for needs opportunities. And we need to give them those opportunities. That's what they're looking for. And if we don't give that to them, they will walk. Because these are quality men and women who've got other things to do, and they want that opportunity. So training on the left-hand arc, right-hand arc is going operations. If told to go in operations, mobilized. In between is opportunities, and we miss that out at our peril.
So what we might call output to defence. So beyond the 27 days training per year, but before you go to deployment, outputs to defence 2 or 3 days at a time, that sort of thing on reserve service days?
On those sort of things, but it could be an STTT, a short-term training team somewhere in part of the world to go and do something. That should be and is open to reservists, should be open to reservists. And even if you get mobilized, the point is they're being used. And of course, for the scales of effort we're talking about, we can do intelligent mobilization. People who say, "Yeah, I fancy doing that. I'm between jobs, or I've got an opportunity now. I had a contract that's finished. I've got a gap. I can get away and do something." Those are the opportunities that they want, and we're pretty good at giving those opportunities. And we should continue to factor that in and make sure that those things are funded.
Can we talk a little bit now about career progression for the part-time volunteer reserve? And if I may, talk about the part-time volunteer reserve who comes from a background of civilian work, full-time civilian work, as opposed to ex-regulars. Would you have a rough feel for how many of our squadron bosses, the officer commanding, are juggling life as a squadron boss and a full-time civilian job? And how many of those posts are filled by ex-regulars rather than someone that's come up through the ranks as a PTVR from day one?
Well, this is one of the things that we are looking to change, and that change will take time. It's not as if, Peter, we're going to turn around next week and say it's all changed. People have commitments built in. There's contracts they're under. I use contracts in a non-legal sense. So 29 of our squadrons, and 3 of them are commanded by PTVR reservists. The rest are commanded by either reservists, PTVR reservists who've stepped up to FTRS, or the majority are ex-regular FTRS. And bear in mind, those ex-regular FTRS who are doing a fantastic job and provide real experience and indeed continuity. Nevertheless, it's 4 years plus 4 years contract. So that's potentially 8 years as a squadron commander of a squadron. And whilst there are some real benefits to that, obviously, there are people then that prevents other people coming out of the regulars into those roles, or reservists stepping up.
It's hard to compete with your annual report that may be fairly, let's say, narrow because of 27 days commitment per year versus someone who's had an SJAR or an OJAR report from a full-time service, which there's huge depth in a regular's annual report versus a PTVR's, perhaps.
I mean, that's true, but I think also you need to look at the reservists and look at what they do in civilian life and see what those skills and experiences that they can bring to bear to us in the RAF. New skills, new outlooks, non-group think, and I think that's what we're looking for. We're looking for to make sure we get we don't constrain ourselves only to the next regular coming out. I mean, they are important. Please don't get me wrong. They are massively important. And as we grow the reserves, and by the way, we haven't gone to numbers, but the aspiration, we're growing from 2,000 PTVR to 5,000 PTVR by 2040. That's going to need an exoskeleton. Is going to need a framework around which to build that, and that is, regulars in the force protection world, or FTRS in most other places. So there's still a role for them, absolutely. But we also want to give more opportunities to PTVRs to bring those other skills that they have into the RAF for our benefit, and that means we need to give them a career structure, and that means we need to spread the FTRS out round further elsewhere in the RAF, not just sitting on a squadron. To fulfil the aspiration and ambition that we have for our reserves, and indeed this will apply to the other two services as well, but certainly for what we're doing in the RAF, there are a number of other enabling type policies and the way we do things that will have to change to accommodate. Like exactly as you say, how do we do our talent management? Do we have a talent management facility for our reserves, or do we just fill gaps, or do we actually have a career, and do we have people looking at talent management? And I know, having talked to Rich Paul, Air Commodore Rich Paul, career management within COSPER's area, Group Captain Bev on the Dacos Reserve, and indeed COSPERS, the aspiration is to move down in that direction. So, it's making sure the policies are there to accommodate our aspirations, rather than saying, no, you have to cut your ambition to the policies we have in place now. Well, that can't be right. So, and some of that change is going to be, is going to be unsettling for people. But I think to get after talent, which is what this is about, we need to open that aperture and make sure we have as wide a talent pool that we can fish in. So, coming back to your point, career opportunities, absolutely. So only 3 of the 29 are PTVR. We want more of them to be PTVR. It's going to take time. I think we've expressed the aspiration of 80%. Will we get to 80%? I don't know, but we have to have a target that is a real stretch target. In the Army Reserve, notwithstanding their reserve primacy, i.e. if there's a man or a woman who is capable, available, and got the time and above the quality level, even with that, 50% of the Army Reserve units are commanded by reservists on PTVR terms, reservist terms. In the Navy, of the 13 regional HMSs, all of them are commanded by PTVR reservist. So why can't we do that? Now, it means doing things differently. And I don't believe, well, first of all, you can't command a squadron in 27 days. You're right. That's why the individual, if they're above the quality line and wants to do it and puts their hat in the ring, understands we're talking probably somewhere around about the 90 to 120 days, probably. And they need to accommodate that. And also, being a reservist doesn't need, as a commander, I would suggest that you don't need to be there all the time. In fact, sometimes you get in the way if you're there all the time. Allow your staff and trust your staff to get on with things, and allow you to look at the bigger picture and have more capacity to deal with the bigger issues, rather than day-to-day running of a squadron.
Reservists are paid a calculation of 1/365th of a regular's salary, but regulars get paid for weekends by nature of their salary, whereas a reservist, if they're on a course, a 5-day course, they get paid for 5 days. A regular on the same course will have been paid for the weekends at either end. I don't know if there's any hope of balance in that, but certainly the way it's presented, could that be made more equitable?
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said it's more about equity and fairness. And certainly, I think the aspiration is that as we, the reserves, get closer, we have closer integration with our regular components, we are being relied on more routinely. We're no longer designed purely for contingency, the war, but actually adding value all the time throughout the whole force, which, by the way, we are very good at in the RAF. As we move in that journey, so too do other things need to catch up. So policies on pay, how we pay, like you said, what proportion do we pay people? What are they paid when they're on op rescript on a, let's say, mobile testing unit in Manchester on RSDs? Is that fair? Should they have some sort of additional protections, if not from mobilization type protections, but insurances to cover themselves if they fall ill, X factor that a regular would get? I think these are legitimate questions we need to ask ourselves, and we are on that journey. Peter, we are. That's what RF30 partly will get after. We'll support that. And I think, these things won't change overnight, but the direction of travel is clear. As we get more integrated, so too do other policies need to be looked at to figure out whether they are still fit for purpose, or, is a policy that was set up in 1908 still relevant to us and needs changing. Now that's not for us. We weren't around in 1908, but the Army Reserve certainly was. So, it's a valid question, but it's more about equity and fairness than it is about pure numbers, I think.
Yeah. So recently, the home to duty allowance was changed, and it made sense why it was changed from a regular setup, just how people have changed their lifestyle now. But there's a number of reserve squadrons that are recruited nationally. And now, so we've got reservists, not by any fault or choice of their own, they're out of pocket. Will those things be looked at? Can reservists look forward to announcements on that sort of thing?
It's certainly been looked at. It's been looked at a single service point of view. We're looking at it with the other two services as well. RF30 has these sort of things in their sight as well, the funding of the reserves. So it is absolutely, these are not sort of forgotten about or swept under the carpet or ignored. All these things that come from our people, both formally through things like ResCars, but also on my visits to squadrons, all these things are then thrown back into the pot to be discussed. But of course, the answers are never always that straightforward. There are knock-on effects. It's whack-a-mole. You solve one problem somewhere, you cause a problem somewhere else. So the sort of things we're looking at now will be, what is a specialist? I know we all think we're special, but what is a specialist? Do we need to differentiate between, one type of trade and another type of trade? Is that so that we can recruit nationally? And of course, the other thing is we need to look at what the impact is on the regulars. The home to duty isn't just a reserve thing. The home to duty applies to regulars as well. So if you change one aspect of it, what impact does that have on the other component? And I know, having looked at this in the past, in a previous role, the answer is yes, it would. If you open up Pandora's box, stand by. So before you do that, let's understand what the impacts could be, what you might lose by opening up the box, and indeed, like all these things, there are priorities. Is home to duty where we want to have some of those battles, or is it somewhere else? With the Treasury and with the centre. So I think we have to pick our fights. And, luckily we've got really good people in the COSPERS area who can help us navigate all of those, because that area is full of rapids.
When I spoke with Warrant Officer Roberts, I asked him if there was anything he'd like to see improved as far as reserves are concerned.
Yes, I think experience within the past 12 months, there are people getting mobilised, stood up, put through the various courses that they have to do, given up some of their own time, and obtained the leave from their civilian employers, only to be told last minute it's now switched off. This has a negative impact on anything we can do with the reserves. It impacts on recruiting. Word gets around that people are not getting treated well, and so I think whenever possible, we should be used. And I understand there will be the odd occasion when it has to happen, but it seems to be more often than not.
What's the knock-on effect to the employers when someone is, let's say, returned to their civilian employment?
Exactly, and the employers are likely to not release them again, and perhaps justifiably so, because they bent over backwards to assist and allow their staff to leave, gone through the recruiting or not for to replace them, and then they appear back on the doorstep saying, "Sorry, we're not needed now. Can we come back to work?" So then, we will struggle to encourage those employers to release them short notice or any notice in the future.
I put this and the similar situation of being bumped off training courses at the last minute to Air Vice Marshal Munro.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to the whole training and education piece about reserves. So if I take those two scenarios you just mentioned, first of all, a reservist being bumped up on a Friday night because there's a regular who says it suited them at this point to be able to do the course, and then the reservist gets bumped off. And that unless there's a driving operational need, then clearly that's wrong. And I know it happens, and it's wrong. Examples where a regular is going on a task in, I don't know, 6 months' time, and yet a reservist gets bumped off on a Friday night for that course. That is fundamentally wrong. And but again, we need to explain that. What's the impact on the reserve? Certainly, if not recruiting, it's retention. They could walk because they don't feel valued. It happens.
And employer support.
Hold on. I'm talking about training now, not mobilization. I'm talking about training.
It'll be the same thing, though, if you've organised a week off of work to attend a training course and that's canned.
Yeah. Oh, okay, fine. Yeah, no, understood. Yes, you're right. So that's wrong because it hacks off the individual, it hacks off the employer. It certainly doesn't give a sense of whole force or value, and we need to educate people on the impact of that, and that shouldn't happen. But of course, if there's an operational need and somebody has to get bumped off, I think we just have to recognize that happens from time to time. In terms of mobilizations, and by the way, we learned a huge number of lessons from COVID and not Rescript, which will feed back into RA30 in terms of not just how we use our reserves, but how we pay them, the medicals, and where does the responsibility sit in terms of entry standards and so on, so theatre entry standards. And if I just dwell on that point, there's a real balance here between us as reservists providing agility to commanders and options to commanders. And of course, one of our attractions is that we can be turned on and turned off. That's the whole point. But we have to recognize also that a reservist comes with a whole sort of ecosystem that a regular doesn't have, i.e. employers and families, of course, but employees mainly. And we recognize that. And if you look at Rescript, we did have to turn people off. To be fair to the way we did that was we didn't just do that because we were told to do it. We looked at it and knew the impact would be. Myself, the inspector, and Dacos Reserve spent a lot of time talking about it and said, right, what's the right thing to do? We then gave a recommendation to DCOM Ops, which went up to, who agreed and went to CAS. And to be fair to the RAF, where we could keep people on, even though we were paying them, if there was a job for them to do and it's no longer on Rescript, we found a way to use them because we recognize exactly what you were talking about the pain of going back, having sorted out their lives. But where we couldn't, we had to stand them down. And I think because it was wrong to mobilize them and then turn them off a week later. So, there were some hard decisions, but there were decisions made with our eyes wide open as to the impact, because we made sure the right people were involved in that decision-making process, not somebody in the organization that didn't understand the impact and just turn on, turn off. But just to finish that point, though, that's exactly one of the lessons learned, and why in the centre, the Reserve Forces Cadet team in the centre are looking at the policy gap between having warned someone off for mobilization and mobilizing them. There's a risk there that sits with the employer and the individual, and not with defence. So defence could literally, on a Friday, turn off for a mobilisation that starts on a Monday, and there'd be no risk on anything, no reputation or even money. But of course, the reserve is carrying that risk, and so is the employer. And we're looking at, and they will be looking, and we'll be helping them, looking at how we can fill that gap to provide a little bit more protection to those reservists. A bit like sort of aircrew. Aircrew do start getting, once they're into a window before flying, there are certain protections they get in there. So is that something we should be looking at?
While it isn't badged as a 0 hours contract, essentially that's what a reservist, a part-time volunteer reserve, is on. However, it doesn't include sick pay. And, that kind of makes sense most of the time. But if you've got, let's say, the OC of a squadron who typically works 2 days a week on the squadron and then they have an accident and they're off for 6 weeks. Shouldn't we not be paying them sick pay during those days that they can't work?
I think we need to understand the different types of reserves there are. Clearly, if you are on full-time reserve service or additional duties commitment, then you will get sick pay. You are on a commitment or a contract for the purpose of this discussion, so you will get sick pay. Then if you turn back to the PTVR component, it's certainly true that in the past that was always seen as casual labor, and there was no pension and there was no sick pay, or indeed holiday pay. But of course because of European law, that changed a number of years ago. So even on RSDs, reserve service days, you were entitled to accrued holiday entitlements and pension. That's a good thing, and it's certainly an attraction. But I do think, Peter, we have to realise or understand who we are as PTVRs. If you want to have those benefits, like sick pay, then or get paid if you can't do work. Let's say COVID. Okay, that was a classic example. I want to get paid, but I can't come into the squadron. Well, if that's what you want, that degree of certainty, and we have the certainty that you should come up to, turn up to work, then that's an ADC commitment or an FTRS commitment. If you as a PTVR, and I include myself in this, if you as a PTVR want the flexibility of not being able to come into work or doing it when it suits me, i.e. my spare time, there's no commitment. And Ver's the same. If there's no commitment to come in because my primacy is my civilian career and I need to shape myself around that, then the other side of that coin is the service. We don't need to give you work and we don't need to pay you when you can't work. There's two sides to this coin. We can't, on the one hand, want all the flexibility as a PTVR, but actually, hold on a minute. Because of COVID, I couldn't come in, and therefore I'm entitled to my 32 days, my 27 days. That doesn't feel right to me. So I think we have to be clear what it is, what the compact is between both organisations.
So going back to the making things equitable between, it's not just reservists and regulars, but even within reserve squadrons, there's situations where you have particular trades or branches where there appears to be inequality. And I'll give you an example. A paramedic has to go through university. They get a degree to be a paramedic and they work for ambulance services. When they're recruited into reserves, they will serve out of phase 2 training. They'll come in as an SAC, so at the bottom of the totem pole. However, nurses who will do a similar health degree to the same academic standard, arguably to the same academic standard, will come in as a corporal, as a junior non-commissioned officer. What are we doing to rebalance some of these apparent inequities?
I don't want to comment specifically about nurses and paramedics, because obviously that is a discussion within the branch and trade advisor and the head of profession. So, and I don't know where they are, and I know they are looking at it, but I'd rather not get into the detail of that. That's their business. But if I talk holistically, though, there is you touched on a really important subject, because there's a lot of work going on both at the centre in the MOD in London, but also in the single services about accreditation both ways, civvy into military, military to civvy. Why ask people to do the same thing again when they've already done it? Secondly, to make sure that we, and actually there will be some examples where, should we pay somebody not on their rank, but for the skills that they bring to us? That is definitely a live discussion, as I say, in MOD in London, Whitehall, but also within the single services. So I don't have an answer for you, Peter, but again, these subjects are being discussed because we recognise in some places there is it's not equitable to treat one component one way and not another. To treat another component another way. So it's making sure we're consistent in how we do things. And of course, so many things we look at, we've already done some of these things. We do pay aircrew more. We do pay medics more. So there are examples where we already pay beyond simply, people's rank. So we've already got those break-in battles. We've led in certain areas. The question going forward, and this will tie in very neatly into some of the discussions we have going forward about those sunrise capabilities that I mentioned. coding, data analytics, cyber. Are we going to get? Are they specialists to the extent that we need to pay them more because of what the skills that they bring in? And are they credited skills, civilian to military, and vice versa? So live discussion. I haven't got an answer for you, but they are recognised.
Wing Commander Mike is a doctor with 4626 Aeromedical Evacuation Squadron, and later this year he retires after more than 30 years as a reservist. I asked him about the changes he's seen during this time in welfare support for reserves and general attitudes towards him and his colleagues.
The welfare package that you get offered and the support that comes through the squadron is fantastic now compared to 30 years ago. So I've no complaints over the way that my family has been supported over that time, even though we manage with children throughout the sort of 5 deployments. And
what about the support for you post-deployment? And if we go back to regular service, I've been a regular myself. When I came back from deployment, I was back to the day job, and there were colleagues who understood everything about the deployment, and I was very well supported. You came back from deployment and went back into the NHS. What continued support was there for you post-deployment?
Again, 30 years ago, very little. We just went back to the routine training. So we were meeting once a month for a weekend training, and we slotted straight back into that. So you had the contact within a short period of time. There was no decompression. There was no callback for group training or decompression. This time, you did have the opportunity to speak to people. You were called back specifically to have a conversation with somebody. But I understand the anxiety working in my field, in the academic field of veterans and family studies. Kings have done work and suggest that reservists do have a slightly higher incidence of problems post-deployment for the very reasons that you have alluded to there, the fact that people don't have the immediate contact with people that they've deployed with. I have to say, in the medical world, that's probably true to some extent, since most clinicians who deploy as individuals who get brought together for pre-deployment training and then dispersed back to the NHS, and regular clinicians do that as well. So reservists aren't unique from that aspect.
But one of the benefits is the squadrons are like families, and 4626 squadron, of all the squadrons I've seen, there's probably no bigger family than 4626. I know 4624 would argue with that. Why does that work so well as a reservist, perhaps compared to what your perceptions are of regular service?
I think reservists generally are different to regulars. I know that from, again, research demonstrates that there are lots of differences in terms of age, life experiences, reasons for staying, reasons for, in essence, volunteering to be deployed. The Intelligent Mobilization Program has worked very well from that point of view. So we aren't forced to deploy in quite the same way as a regular. Our motivation for attending reserve training is different from somebody who's doing it as their day job on a regular basis. So I think we are slightly different. And when we come together as squadrons for our weekend training, it is that 2 days in the month where you do bond and work as a team and together. Whereas regulars, if you're seeing somebody on a day-to-day basis, it isn't quite the same relationship as people I used to work with in the NHS that you saw day in and day out. The weekend training is a bit of a highlight to the weekend or to the month, really.
One of the unique features of squadron life in the reserves is that you don't get posted. You stay with the same squad. You've been on 4626 for more than 30 years, so you must know your colleagues there pretty well by now.
Absolutely. Not only that, I was fortunate enough to be the OC on 4626 for Gulf War II. And it would have been entirely possible to have generated a flight for Gulf War II out of the people who were still there from Gulf War I. And pretty much they would have been in the same role. Some of them would have been promoted by 1 or 2 ranks, but they would still have been in the same role as a nurse or a medic or an MSO. And in that sense, we would have been entirely confident in each other's skills and our ability to work with each other, because we would have done it for over 20 years, even at that point.
So, you get to know each other's strengths and weaknesses over that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of a squadron, there is churn, as with any organisation, but you do get to know the individual, and you get to know about their family and their children, and even the name of their dog sometimes.
Finally, I'd like to ask you about the relationship that you've witnessed between reserves and regulars over this period of time, and perhaps how that has changed in terms of attitude.
Again, I would think we were still at the time of the Cold War, with nobody having been deployed. We were still very much seen as the weekend warriors. That was no doubt the epithet. But straight after Gulf War I, that completely changed. We moved into major exercises. Then I remember Save Syria, and everybody understood that Save Syria, from a medical perspective, couldn't or wouldn't have happened without the RAF medical reserves and the aeromedical evacuation chain that was established using reserves. Almost everybody I meet now in the Air Force regulars, certainly in the medical world, have worked with reservists, either on exercise or on deployment. So I can't speak for the RAF reserves in totality, but certainly when I passed through Bryce Norton on aeromedical duties, working, you know that you don't know if the mover that's handling you or the pilot flying the plane are regular or reserves. Nobody bothers to ask, and nobody, I don't think, is particularly interested anymore. We've lost all the descriptors on our uniforms now, and everybody, I think, now recognises the reservists for the work that they've done over the past 30 years.
For people toying with the idea of becoming an RAF reservist, there's plenty of information on raf.mod.uk. But what's the advice from on the ground? First of all, to aircraft woman Lee, with advice for those with no previous military experience.
The RAF, to me, it doesn't matter if you're male or female. At the end of the day, it's what you've got a passion for, and that's what they push you for, and that's what they're looking for. It's those people that are enthusiastic in the role, rather than if you're male or female. Going through my training, there was a variety of people. I mean, there was people that were paramedics. There was people that were going in as officers. There was one guy was worked at a funeral director's kind of thing. So, I mean, if you have that desire to do something different, just away from the mundane kind of civilian roles, I suppose, and you kind of want that excitement, then definitely I think it would be something you should look to do, most definitely.
And for advice about switching from regular to reserve, Warrant Officer Roberts.
I would go along and give it a try. As in, I don't necessarily mean sign up, but just go along. Because if a regular approached us and said, can we come to one of your training weekends and see how you operate? Or just come Monday to Friday and see, there's always HQ staff around. There's regulars and reservists full-time that are there all the time. And we would welcome them to come and have a look, or just deploy sometime with us. There's no reason why they can't. And we've also now set up a special constabulary relationship with most units in the Air Force, where if we have an RAF police reservist living near an Air Force base, they can just set up a relationship with that base where they can go and work for them whenever they are free. As long as there's the agreement between the OC of the RAF police on that unit, and then they get paid by us to go to a unit and support. And that is another, most of them now will start working with reserves, hopefully, within the near future.
To wrap up our conversation about life as a reservist and Future Reserves 30, I asked Air Vice Marshal Munro what he believed were the biggest threats to the RAF reserves and what were the biggest drivers.
I think probably the biggest threats is the ability for the organisation to change its culture. And of course, the dominant culture is the regular culture, inevitably and understandably, and always will be. These things they both have to be shaped to accommodate each other, and both need to change their shape to accommodate each other, because we're on this journey to a much more integrated reserve, much more whole force, for the drivers we mentioned earlier, money, but also skills. So the culture, which is about education, so people understand what they've got, who they are, and how to adapt their behaviour to accommodate the reservist. So that's one. The other is money. The lack of money. When you're sitting there prioritising, it's taking some really hard decisions about where you spend your money. Is it platform systems or is it people? And of course, it's not as easy as that. But it is recognising that we're all having to plan and deliver in a very financially constrained environment. So those are probably the two key drivers or two key dangers that you asked for. But I think the driver, I'm positive about the driver, and the driver is, I'm not sure there's a plan B. The driver is, what is our other plan? I mean, we've got men and women in the reserves who desperately want to join our organisation for all the reasons I've just said. Challenging, rewarding, progressive training, opportunities, organisation that values them, with values and standards and an ethos that they subscribe to. They desperately want to serve with us. If we can't find a way to unleash that potential, then what does that say about us? But I can tell you now, having talked to the SLT, senior leadership team, but also driven by CAS and the two DCOMs, Chief of the Air Staff and both Deputy Commanders, they are absolutely unequivocal in their support of the reserves and wanting to make sure we unleash that potential. It will only benefit us in the future.
So massive opportunity for the Royal Air Force to better employ our reserves, and a superb opportunity for our reservists to have an enjoyable and fulfilling career.
And bear in mind, some of what I've said might come across as negative. It's not intended to be. As a reservist now, it's never been a better time. We've had FR20, we've had RF30, Reserve Optimization, Astra. We've been used in Iraq and Afghanistan. We haven't just been used. I mean, we've had outstanding service in those theatres, and others, by the way, from the Olympics to Rescript, to Biloxi, to all the other sort of exercise operation names you can come up with. We've had reservists on there. And so things have changed dramatically since I certainly joined the reserves. We're in a good place, but I think we're yet on a journey to even greater integration, which means all these other policies that we talked about need to start aligning to facilitate the ambition and aspiration we have for our reserves.
Well, we all look forward to that and look forward to the future. Air Vice Marshal Munro, Commandant General, thank you for being on Inside Air.
Well, no, thank you for the opportunity to tell everybody and to show a little bit of ankle about what we're up to. It is massively exciting times. And now that we stand up the Reserve Directorate, or about to, you will see, I think, a lot more activity where we're asking people across the whole firmament, regular, academics and reservists from squadrons as well, bottom-up designing how we get to where we are now, to the new vision for the RAF Reserve. So stand by, everybody out there, to be either volunteering or be volunteered to take part in sprints to give your views, because we want to make sure that whatever comes out the other end is an informed view about options available, that the EXCO and the SLT then can decide option A, A, B or C, which way do you want to go. And I'm determined that all our people will be part of that design. So it's not done to them. They are shaping their own destiny and their own part of the journey towards reserve optimization.
I am NAC Victoria Andrews with a recap of some recent news stories on Inside Air. Chief of the Air Staff Air Chief Marshal Sir Mike Wigston has laid a wreath on behalf of the RAF at the Air Force's Memorial, Runnymede Memorial, to honour the 20,000 servicemen and women of the Commonwealth Air Forces who died during World War II and who have no known grave. Meanwhile, in France, on the 77th anniversary of the Normandy landings, a new memorial was unveiled. The British Normandy Memorial records the names of 22,442 people who were killed on D-Day and at the Battle of Normandy. Number 1 Air Mobility Wing from RAF Bryce Norton have taken part in Exercise Swift Pirate at RAF Wittering. The training was to prepare for overseas humanitarian operations in a scenario where personnel were required to deliver humanitarian assistance to the victims of a catastrophic natural disaster. RAF Chinooks, currently deployed in Mali in support of French military counter-terrorist operations, have passed a significant milestone there, recording 3,000 hours of operational flight time. The Chinooks carry out troop movements, resupply missions, and offer logistical support to the French forward operating bases and desert locations. And finally, on home soil, hundreds of personnel from across the 3 services have been providing specialist maritime, air and land security support to Devon and Cornwall Police during the G7 Leader Summit which took place in the region. Defence provided naval vessels, aircraft, planning staff, logistics support, facilities and explosive ordnance disposal teams to ensure the summit was delivered in a safe and secure way for local communities and dignitaries. That's Reheat on Inside Air.
I'm SAC Simon Ross with this episode's Name That Noise. That was the sound of an L85A2 magazine load during a live firing detail with the RAF regiment. The L85 rifle has been the standard issue service rifle of the British Armed Forces since 1986. The A2 variant is the Heckler & Koch updated version of the SA-80 L85 and is one of the most accurate individual weapons currently available. But early variations were not without their teething problems, as they initially struggled to perform in more extreme environments such as the jungle, Arctic and desert. This prompted a number of changes to the rifle, which makes it what it is today. A new style of trigger was added which is able to cut through snow that might be packed tightly behind the trigger itself. Also, an improved cocking handle helps to deflect casings as they eject from the rifle. The addition of a lightweight day sight, Picatinny rail and drop grip with bipod has greatly increased this rifle's utility on the battlefield.
That's all for this episode of Inside Air. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. Inside Air is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.